Well, I'm sitting down. That means one of two things. Either I've torn another Achilles, torn up a knee, broke my back, done something like that, or I'm going to tell you a story. It's the latter. Today, you get to hear a Father's Day tale. Morty was standing in the courtyard in the marketplace of a very, very large city. Morty was a nickname by all sorts of cultures. This city had walls that he was looking out on at that time that were 2 feet thick. They needed to be 2 feet thick because the summer times there could get up above 105 degrees. In the wintertime, super, super mild, maybe 50, 55 at the lowest. But those thick, thick walls would sometimes hold in some heat, and sometimes it would protect you from the extreme heat and make it a little bit cooler. They also had aqueducts and water running all over here and there. They often had moving water, and that would help kind of keep things cooler on the inside. But boy, where Morty lived, you wore loose clothing, and you didn't wear a whole lot of it if you could help it, and you never worked in the afternoons. You worked early mornings, into the evening, afternoon, you were inside because it was hot. As he stood there in that marketplace, he was surrounded by just all sorts of cultures and priests that worked at the temple. Many, many, many priests. People from all sorts of nations. You had officials, you had dignitaries walking around, and the smell of the marketplace was powerful. Man, you could smell cumin and coriander and all sorts of different, cilantro was all over the place. You could smell the richest of perfumes, a lot of them based in rose oil. There were some with frankincense, myrrh, a lot of them had tannins in them, and it was expensive stuff. You also could smell onions and garlic and the richness of real sweet dates and hundreds of pounds of almonds with that woodsy smell about them. And so it was some experience being there, and there was really nothing like it in the whole world. And while he stood there, Morty reflected on the past. He was an old man now. He was young when all of this stuff started, I'm going to share with you, but he's old now, and he's reflecting. And he looks off to the west at a place where he's never been, his homeland of Israel, where he's never seen. And he looks out across the statutes of silence. Now what those are is in this culture, you didn't bury people. You put them up on a foundation up in the air where you lifted them. And you would leave the body there because bodies were considered unclean. And so you'd leave them for the birds to pick, and then when the birds had picked them, you'd bury the bones. And he's looked out across that field of all of these bodies up in the air. He thought about Israel. And he started reflecting back on all of the things he's seen, and he especially remembered the time when his daughter, quote daughter, came into his home. She was just a light. She was a source of joy. Beautiful eyes, beautiful little girl, full of spirit, full of spunk, gifted with wisdom. And he took her in and made her his own. She was an orphan, you see. She was an immigrant too, not an immigrant by choice. She was a forced immigrant like everybody else of her kinsmen. Should have been a grandparent. These days, a lot of kids get taken in by their grandparents, right? Kind of kinship adoptions. But there were no grandparents. 4 of them had to be around somewhere, but they didn't take her. You'd think maybe an aunt and uncle, there had to be a lot of those too. Maybe an aunt and uncle would take her in, but nobody did. But Morty did. Morty was cousin Morty. He took her in, and together they started a life in a great city, the capital of the entire known world at the time. And they started this wonderful, simple life. Now they're surrounded by temples, pieces of which still exist today, grand buildings, aqueducts, all sorts of advanced technology for that time. But they lived in the midst of all that in a simple life. It was a time of tremendous politics and a time of crazy power. It was the time you've seen movies about. It was the period of the Battle of Thermopylae, where legend says 300 Greek soldiers held off 300,000 Persian soldiers. Well, that's a little bit of a stretch. There were actually about 7,000 Greeks. Nonetheless, they held off 300,000 for 2 entire days until they got betrayed. This is the time of the naval battle of Salamis, which the Persians got beaten up pretty badly and learned a lesson. You can't keep spreading all across the world without spreading yourself too thin, and pretty soon you're going to pay the price for that. His little cousin's name was Hattie. Little Hattie grew up hearing stories. She heard stories of their ancestors and tales of Adam and Eve. And he would tell her all sorts of stories about Abraham, Joseph, Moses in the Exodus, and how their people had all this power, and they'd had kingdoms, and they destroyed kingdoms, and how they were God's people. And he instilled in her a love for the stories of the Old Testament and a love for God, deeply, deeply embedded faith. And they lived just a humble life full of joy. A life where they would have at that time enjoyed meals together and sitting together and telling tales together and wine together and joy and laughter. And she was just a beacon of hope. Now, the culture they lived in, they were Zoroastrians. That's a big name. You look that up sometime. There's still some around today. The Zoroastrians believed in one God, just like us. One God. There was only one. That was Ahura Mazda was the name of their God. They had a devil too. His name was Angra. So they worshipped Ahura Mazda. They didn't want much to do with Angra. They believed that life, all of life, was a battle between good and evil. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? They also believed in a spirit, that Ahura Mazda would send the Spirit of God to live with you. And they had a mantra. Their mantra was, good thoughts, good words, good deeds. That's pretty good, isn't it? I mean, that's a pretty good philosophy by which to live. Good words, good thoughts, good deeds. That's how they lived their life. And that's how Morty and Hattie, that's what they were surrounded with. They also believed that their faith was the only faith, but they were tolerant of others, just believing you were somewhat misguided. Well, there was a powerful king there. Boy, he was strong. He was a world conqueror, and he was a very, very strong individual. And he was going to have a party. This guy's going to get assassinated. Lots of leaders do. And back then, that's kind of the way kingdoms progressed, was from one assassination to the other. He wanted to have a party, and he wanted this party to be the party of all parties that everybody talked about for generations. He wanted it to be a spectacle of how much power his kingdom has, and a spectacle of how much money he's got, and how much they can just blow money on anything. And so he invited officials and statesmen and kings from other areas and leaders, all the rich people of the area, and they were going to share the greatest food, the best wine you could possibly have, and the best entertainment. Unfortunately, the king got a little drunk. Actually, he got a lot drunk. And being a lot drunk, he called for his wife, who was the queen. And he said, I want you to put your crown on and come over here and show all these people how beautiful you are. A little offensive, right? Now, we don't know in history, but he did say put your crown on. He may have been saying that's all I want you to put on. We don't know, but he wants her to come in and parade around to show all these people how grand his wife is. She doesn't like that idea. That feels a lot like being a prize horse. And so she said, no, I'm not coming. Well, that's not really exactly what the king wanted to hear, and that's not the kind of thing you told your husband back in those days. But she said, I'm not going to show up. Well, that not only was against the culture, now you got him in a position where the eunuchs know that he asked her to come, because he sent the eunuchs to her. They know that she just rejected the king's word, and the king's thinking that's a horrible precedent to set around the kingdom. And so he asked his wise men and all of his folks, he said, man, what should I do about this? His counselors, what are we going to do? Well, I don't guess he wanted to kill her, so they said, well, we got to set an example so other women don't think they can do this, and so let's just banish her. So he threw her out of his palace. We don't know what happened to her after that. She's just gone. Well, they're going to replace her. Now, it's not like he doesn't have other wives, but he doesn't have another queen. So they're going to replace her, and they have a beauty contest of sorts. They have a wonderful beauty contest to find the most beautiful woman in all of the land, and somehow Hattie gets nominated, and she wins. She's considered the most beautiful woman around, and she's going to become queen. Now, Morty knows that Jews are looked down on and that there's a lot of prejudice and racism against Jews. And so he tells Hattie, he says, look, don't tell this guy you're a Jew. That won't go good. And so she keeps that to herself, and she goes and lives in all of this opulence and all of this money and all of this wealth, but she never ever forgets her roots. Hattie always remembers to be humble. She always keeps wisdom in her heart, God's wisdom. And she always keeps her faith. Her faith is always strong as queen of this empire. And old Morty, he's always around. He's always hanging out. He's always outside the walls of the big palace. He's always coming around to see Hattie and see how she's doing. Now, a problem arises because there's this official in the kingdom, and he hates Jews. He can't stand them. He just wants to get rid of them. Poor Jews. All through history, everybody's wanting to get rid of the Jews. This guy hates them, and so he comes across Morty one day, and he demands as an official that Morty, as a Jew, bow down to him. Now, Morty's not going to put up that kind of arrogance at that moment, so he doesn't do it. Whew. The official gets so mad that he goes to the king, and he says, look, this Jew would not bow down to me. He's full of disrespect, and what I want you to do is I want you to sign a decree that on this date, we're going to kill them all. We're going to do the first Holocaust. We are going to practice genocide and destroy every Jew in this kingdom, and the king signs it, not knowing that he just signed his wife's death warrant. Now, Morty and all the Jews, of course, they're all alarmed, man. They're thinking, what on earth are we going to do? We're going to all die on this given date. What can happen? Now, Morty knows that Hattie's the key to this deal. He knows. And so he goes to her, and he says, look, you're the key. You're going to have to tell him that you're a Jew, and you're going to have to plead on behalf of our people. And her response, of course, is, if I do that, he's going to kill me. You don't just show up at the king's court to talk. That's not allowed. I can't just walk in to his room and start talking to him. He'd kill me. So in her wisdom, Hattie, trained by a great daddy, said, all right, I want all of the Jews I want you to pray and fast for 3 solid days, and I want you to pray for God's intervention. Ask God to step into this situation before I go talk to him. Well, they prayed and fasted for 3 days, so Hattie goes, and she goes to the king's room, and she stands there. And the king looks at her, and she's so gorgeous, and she's so full of courage that he just can't help himself. He invites her in, and he drops his staff. Now, when he drops his staff, that means you're good to go. He doesn't drop his staff, you're probably going to die. He drops his staff, and he tells Hattie, you can speak. And she says, I'm a Jew. And I'm sure his jaw just dropped. And she told him, she said, I'm going to tell you what I want, but I want to have a festival. I want to have a celebration. I want to have a party. And I want that official to come. The king says, okay. So they have their little celebration, their dinner party, and she says to the king, I want to tell you what this official did. He refused because of this man, Morty, her daddy. He refused to bow down to the official, and the official came to you and sat you up so that you'd kill all of us, including me. The king was incensed. He said, he's going to be killed today. Now, they had some gallows built. Those gallows were going to be where Morty was going to be hung as an example of disobedience before they killed all the Jews. And on those same gallows that were made for Morty, the official gets hung. Now, the king can't change his decree. A decree is a decree from a king, but what he does do is he puts an addendum on it, and he says, the Jews can fight back. Well, you don't want to go practice a Holocaust when they got weapons, and so it didn't happen. So they're all now saved, and the thing is over. And Morty gets elevated in the kingdom. Now he's an advisor to the king, and he's an advisor to his daughter. And together, Morty and Hattie design a celebration, and they create a new festival for all the Jewish people, and it's called Purim. And in this festival of Purim, they celebrate the deliverance of God. Don't we celebrate that too, that we've been delivered from the devil? We've been delivered from condemnation. Man, they got Purim to celebrate deliverance, and it's a festival day where there's tons of good food, where you give gifts of food to people, you know, like when you give somebody a pie, stuff like that, and they celebrate by taking care of the poor. And so you got the Feast of Purim where a woman is being honored, Hattie, because of her strength and her courage and her faith and the support of a father. And there's dancing on the streets, and there's joy on the streets, and they celebrate unity, and they celebrate family. Now, many of you know I'm telling you the story of Esther and Mordecai. Straight out of the Bible. This is the story of a man that adopted his little cousin. And because of that, he changed the world. And the bond of Esther and Mordecai continued and grew. And Mordecai supported Esther, and he supported the king. He was part of their life, of King Xerxes, who followed King Darius. And Mordecai was an example, was a testament of a father's love. And he sits in, as he stands in the marketplace now as an old man, I'm sure he was reflecting on the decision to take in Esther, whose name was Hadassah. That's why I called her Hattie. And he was thinking of his decision to make her his own, and how that decision would save tens of thousands of Jews. You never know where your decisions are going to go. You never know what God might do with your acts of kindness. You never know what God's going to do when you make the right decision. And so here in the heart of the Persian Empire is an example of God's grace and shown through the light of Esther. And the city called Susa, Shush for some, it continued to grow. It continued to prosper. It continued in politics and wealth. And it's not always going to be the capital, but it continued to grow. And Esther, because she stood firm in her faith, teaches us an example that God's light can defeat darkness anywhere. There's nowhere God's light can't shine. There's nowhere that God can't bring peace, that God can't resolve problems. All because a father made a choice. And you see, what I celebrate today about Mordecai is this. It's a choice. Anybody can make a kid. But being a father is a choice. Being a daddy is a choice to be there every single day. And to teach your kids the way of faith, and to tell them the stories of faith, and tell them about men like Bill who have been faithful all of these years, and to tell them the stories of our patriarchs, and tell them the stories of the growth of the kingdom of God, and enrich their lives in that way. Well, Susa was inhabited for about 8,000 years. But it hadn't been inhabited now for about 700. It's all ruins. It's gone. But the story of Esther and Mordecai will always be told. A great, great